We're gonna start pretty close to the top of the hour, but thank you very much for giving us some time out of your evening. I'm Corey Saylor. I'll be hosting it. I'll sort of do a more formal introduction in a second. But welcome everybody. Appreciate you giving us some time, and we're looking forward to the session. So extra appreciation to all of you early birds. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum. We're going to get started. Just a couple seconds. Assalamu alaikum again. It's just at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody who was in the webinar with us already. We'll get started in just a second. Do want to show you extra appreciation though. We have a running joke in my own family. My wife is from Afghanistan. And when we set out wedding invitations, we invited my family from America for 7 o'clock, and we sent out invitations to her family for 5 o'clock. You can see it like one side is English, one side is Farsi, and everybody showed up right there at 7 o'clock. So all of you are showing up right on the top of the hour. We appreciate you being on time. We'll get started in just a second. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Corey Saylor. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I am the Research and Advocacy Director with the Council on American Islamic Relations, and I get the opportunity to give you a couple of outstanding presenters tonight. The last few weeks have been just a tragedy that's really beyond understanding. And as we at the Council on American Islamic Relations have been addressing this tragedy, we are a civil rights organization. We are the largest Muslim civil rights organization in the country. We provide legal services free of charge to people who have been discriminated against, advocacy services to people who have been shown various difficulties because of their advocacy on behalf of Palestine. We've just really been watching the trends here in the United States as we get what is the biggest wave of backlash that we have seen since Donald Trump announced his plan to ban Muslims from this country in December of 2015. And this webinar became particularly important to us as we saw that among the trends that are standouts in this particular wave of backlash was initially the targeting of students. So you had doxing trucks driving around Harvard with the pictures and names of students who had spoken up on behalf of Palestinian humanity. You had Google Sheets with the names and personally identifiable information of Muslim students. You had corporations, the heads of corporations saying, give us the list of Muslims who have spoken out on behalf of Palestinian humanity and we won't hire them. So early on, students were one of the major targets. Since we saw that wave, we are now seeing that in places of employment, people are sometimes being called into the HR department to discuss work and advocacy that they've done outside of the work setting. So we wanted to put this webinar together for you because that challenge to free speech, that challenge that you might face in your place of employ are two of the top types of cases that have been coming into our organization over the last 4 weeks. We've received over 1,000 different requests for help and reports of bias in the last few weeks. And the majority of those fall into the categories of either employment, things that are happening in the workplace, or free speech, challenges to your ability to speak your mind on behalf of people who are suffering under a decades-long occupation and apartheid. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce our two speakers for the evening, and then I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'm going to let them give their expertise to you. We do have some time built in at the end of the program for questions and answers. So if you have a question, put it into the chat now, and we'll look at trends in the questions, and we'll try to pick out a few questions that are representative of the trends of what we're seeing. We don't have the chat enabled tonight because we wanted the primary focus of tonight's webinar to be on our speakers and not on conversations in the chat. So please do use the question and answer feature. So Nabila, if I can have you turn your camera on and join us. Assalamu alaikum, welcome.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, just to quickly introduce you before we have you dive into your remarks, Nabila El Sayed's career includes 20 years of leadership roles across operations, corporate affairs, human resources, strategy, and technology at 3 of the world's most recognized brands, Walmart, IKEA, and Starbucks Coffee. Most recently, she held the role of Chief Operations Officer at Walmart Canada. I think that lays out her expertise enough for everyone and makes her uncomfortable enough that I'm reading that while she's sitting on screen. So I'm going to go ahead, Nabila, and turn it over to you. Nabila is going to focus on how you as an employee can deal with your speech on behalf of Palestinian humanity in the workplace. Thanks, Nabila.
Wonderful. Jazakallah khair. Thanks for having me again. And just give me a second here while I pull up the presentation. All right. Are we good on the presentation, Corey?
You are perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So my intention during this conversation or my segment is just to lay out kind of the organizational system from a corporate perspective when it comes to positions on political issues or social issues. And before I get started, I just want to reiterate that every situation is unique. So I am obviously speaking in generalities today. And I want to just give you a few examples of how this can play out for you as an individual. So you might be in a situation where you feel generally comfortable with the position that your company has taken, but maybe you feel uncomfortable with your direct manager and having a dialogue with them, or maybe you feel uncomfortable with a colleague and some of the statements that they've made. So that's one scenario. Another scenario might be where you feel uncomfortable with the position your corporation has taken, but you feel really comfortable with your direct employee or your immediate team, and your immediate team and direct manager are doing a good job of respecting your lived experience and respecting the situation that you're going through. And then in unfortunate, I think worst case scenario, you really perhaps in a toxic environment where you don't feel safe or comfortable within your team or the organization, or you feel like you're being targeted and the environment is quote unquote toxic. So again, this isn't what I'm going to say isn't going to address each of those examples, because it really is on a case-by-case basis. And as we would say in any situation, based on your individual experience, we definitely advise that you speak to someone about your unique experience. With that being said, I do want to do a bit of an introduction and provide context on the organizational perspective. And my point in doing this is I want you to understand the system that you're operating within. And you might be wondering, like, why this is, because when you have the organization's perspective, when you have the perspective of the individuals who are making the decisions about if to say something or not to say something, or, you know, the risks that they're considering when and when not to say something or how to engage, then you know how to approach them. For many years, the predominant strategy within organizations when it came to social issues, especially issues that were political of nature, was silence. And today, we're seeing that actually play out. For a lot of organizations, they prefer to be silent. And the reason for that is because, especially if they're large organizations, they have offices around the world. When there's a global conflict or a global issue, they know that there's going to be a diverse array of perspectives and probably a lot of contrary views, and that contrary views are going to be fraught with tensions. And so from a corporation's perspective, or from a head of corporate affairs or a head of HR or even a CEO's perspective, they feel like it's a lose-lose situation. And no matter what they say, they're ultimately going to alienate one or multiple segments of their associate or customer base. Some organizations that have taken a step forward to take a stance on a social issues have seen this backfire. And again, the other issue that corporations face when making these decisions is they find it to be extremely difficult to be consistent. So this is always the kind of a factor in the background when organizations, CEOs, heads of HR, heads of corporate affairs, and executive teams are making decisions about when and when not to say something when social issues arise. I would also say that a lot of really large organizations are, if they're not staying silent, are taking a wait and see approach. And I actually think this wait and see approach is prudent if they're using that time to better understand the situation at hand. And what I say by that is that if they're using that time to listen to their employees, to listen to varying views, to listen to, and to learn and educate themselves from, sources that are reliable. When they take this wait and see approach, a lot of times companies are just being more prudent to form an opinion. And I know this can be frustrating if you're an internal employee and you feel like the organization isn't recognizing and seeing, what is obvious to you. But keep in mind that this wait and see approach is it's also a risk mitigation approach. It's allowing them to form an opinion or figure out how to straddle a situation with tension. So some of the examples, we've seen a lot of, for example, corporate statements that came out immediately after October 7th. And then we've seen some statements that have come out a week later, 10 days later, or even now a month later. And if you compare statements that are coming out now versus the ones that initially came out on October 7th, ones that have taken this more wait and see approach tend to be more balanced, tend to be more recognize the vastness of what's happening, and are more generally, and I'm making generalizations here, but tend to be a bit more based on the humanitarian crisis that's happening versus just what happened on October 7th. So again, this is just to give you a sense of the approach that companies take. I think the other thing that's really important that I want you guys to know is that organizations have no obligation to say anything at all. And again, many organizations don't want to say anything, especially when there's a situation or a social issue that has so much risk involved. Staying quiet allows them to address the situation internally without alienating consumers or stakeholders or broader employment groups. So they can take this more kind of stay quiet approach, address it internally, maybe make an internal statement, and ask managers to deal with associates or customers on a case-by-case basis. And though, again, this may frustrate you because you don't feel like the company's taking a clear stand, this tends to be a lower risk approach and one that companies will lean on in high tense situations and situations that have very strongly held beliefs. On the other side, we have, again, seen companies speak up, and if they've done so, equitably recognizing the conflict on both sides. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're rewarded for that. They still might get a lot of criticism for that based on how they decided to do that. But when companies do speak up externally, they consider this to be a higher risk. And it could also increase tensions within the workplace. So, they're also facing brand and reputational risk when they make external statements. And again, you might think about this and say, okay, well, so what? I put these things on a page because I want you to understand when you're going to ask your organization for something, these are the thoughts that are going in the minds of the decision makers about what to do and how to handle situations. So this is what they're considering. And as a COO and a CHRO in large organizations, these are the things that I would have to weigh when I made decisions like this as well in the past. Now, does that mean that we all log off and stop trying to make a difference or advocate for what you believe is right and advocate for your organization to take a stand? No, because you do have power and influence, because just, like everything I said was true in terms of the background of what's happening in the minds of corporate leaders and corporations. Companies also know that more than ever, consumers and customers and even investors are belief driven, which means that consumers, customers, and investors will choose brands or avoid a brand because of the stand that company takes on a social issue. In fact, according to a poll by Edelman, which is the largest and one of the most respected communication firms out there, 92% of investors believe that business leaders must use their power and influence to advocate for positive change. 64% of belief-driven consumers will choose, switch, or avoid a brand based on a stand on a societal issue. And 61% of belief-driven employees will choose, leave, avoid an employer based on their values and beliefs. So this data should give you confidence that you do have leverage and you can use it to advocate for what you believe needs to be true from your communication department, your diversity, equity, inclusion department, your HR department, your senior leaders. It reflects the influence and the power that these different stakeholder groups have in pushing a company to use its size and its scale for social good. And we see this happening more and more. We see that companies are expected to, and consumers and employees expect companies to take stands on important societal issues. So that's a bit of the context. I wanted to move to your choices as an employee. So I've kind of bucketed your choices into three categories. One is work within that system that I just described. Another one is to work publicly, try to ignore the organizational system that you're in. And the third one is working within the system, but on a longer view perspective. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So working within the system, there's actually many levels to this. And the first and most straightforward level is focusing purely on your personal life experience. So, it's about your experience as an individual, how what's happening in Gaza is affecting you, whether you have family directly involved or indirectly involved, or friends that are directly involved or indirectly involved, or whether or not you're experiencing vicarious trauma through what's happening and how that's affecting your life and your ability to do your work. So no one can tell you that your lived experience and what you're experiencing as an individual is wrong. And I want to emphasize this because it might feel like that's not enough, vocalizing your personal experience and your lived experience is how it's affecting you. But that in and of itself is also advocacy, because a lot of times this happens on a one-on-one conversation, you and your manager, you and your colleague, you and your HR partner, and it's having that dialogue. And as they experience that with you, it may change their perspective. they may avoid using slogans or statements that they didn't know were offensive or harmful. They might have a broader understanding of the situation, and they may make them more open to having a different stance. So I think this one-on-one level of sharing your lived experiences is a form of advocacy, and it is changing. It does have an impact on the system. So I think the second level of advocacy is to ask the company to do something. So not just honor and respect your lived experience as an individual, but maybe you want them to change or amend a statement, donate funds to to Gaza or to the conflict. Maybe you want them to create space more formally for people who are having, who are Muslims in the workplace, who want to voice their concerns and address their concerns. So this is going to take a bit more work on your part. If your organization hasn't done something like this in the past, or you need to do your work and you need to evaluate their DE&I strategy, you need to look at the corporate values, you need to look at their philanthropic policy, and talk to them about how doing this is in line with those policies and procedures. And I'll give you an example. So at IKEA, one of the major philanthropic ambitions of IKEA is around refugees and addressing the refugee crisis. Another major focus of IKEA's philanthropic giving is around housing and housing security. So if I was still there, and I don't know if IKEA has made a statement or not in this current situation, but I would be talking about how standing for the people of Gaza is a refugee issue, and standing for what's happening in Gaza is about, addressing the protection of refugees and the protection of housing. These are the things that IKEA has said is important to them, and areas of that they want to donate to and stand for. And so how do I make that connection for them to see that standing for what's happening for the people of Palestine is directly related to their corporate values, to their philanthropic mission, and is in alignment with what they say they believe in. So making that statement, making that really clear, and bringing that to decision makers so that you can help them understand and see that. So the third level of advocacy is to address situations and protect your rights or the rights of others if you believe that they're been violated, or you're in an unsafe environment, or you're actually facing some level of discrimination or harassment. And again, this also takes some homework. Read your company's code of conduct, read your company's social media policy, understand what the escalation model is, so you know how to leverage it. If you're being approached by HR, you need to participate respectfully in the internal investigation, but of course, get professional legal counsel and advice on your specific circumstances and situation, and advocate for yourself and the protection of your rights and the rights of others if you feel like they are being violated. So those are the ways to work within the system. Then it's working publicly. So say, you know what, I'm not going to worry about the situation at work. I just want to advocate for what I personally believe is correct outside of work. And you can focus your efforts and advocacy on that. Still really important to make sure that you understand all the policies I previously mentioned, plus your social media policy, if it exists. Some companies have it, some companies don't. Because anything you do or say, even if on your company or your own, so even outside of company time and on your own personal, channels and personal time, it could be considered a violation of company policy. So you do need to understand these company policies. And I know there's a very strong and rightfully so, a call for people to take a stance on what is happening. But I also just want to share, and some people might not recognize this, but depending on the level of seniority that a person has, so if they're an officer of the company, or if they're a partner of the company, or if they're in any kind of public facing role, there's more restrictions on what they can say and do outside of work. People in those types of positions are considered representatives of the company, basically 24/7. So it's really important that you understand what the company's policies are before you state anything on social media. All right, then there's the long game. And I know, because I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, that there's this very strong sense of being disheartened by anything DE&I that an organization has said they stand for, or any DE&I related work that's out there right now. And I understand the sentiment, but I also have seen some of the I've also seen the positive effects of diversity, equity, inclusion work in the workplace. And I want to talk about the long game. And the long game means strengthening our position as Muslim professionals in positions of influence in organizations, strengthening our representation and confidence as Muslims in our workplace. This means educating our employers, our managers, our colleagues on issues of significance that matter to our faith. And it means working within the diversity, equity, inclusion ethos to advocate for recognition and accommodation that makes Muslims feel valued, seen, and respected at work. And there are organizations that do this, they do it, and they do it well. Examples of organizations that have Muslim ERGs, very large ones. And I think, again, when I look at some of the statements that have come out, I know the companies that have these Muslim ERGs, and these Muslim ERGs matter in these organizations. Their voices matter, their perspectives matter. They have a collective influence on the organization, on leadership. And that's making a difference in these organizations. Or an interfaith ERG. And maybe your company doesn't have ERGs. So then you start with things like, how can I bring awareness to days of significance like Eid or Islamic History Month or Anti-Islamophobia Month? Can we do an anti-Islamophobia workshop? What can be done to just educate and create awareness of what matters to Muslims in the workplace? So I understand the sentiment that happens right now, but unfortunately, this won't be the last conflict that we face. Whether it was 9/11 or the Iraq War or the war in Syria or the Muslim ban or what's happening right now, we need to continue to strengthen our positions in the workplace and not just get a seat at the table, but get the system to recognize and advocate for what we believe is important in the workplace. Then there is the option to actually leave your workplace, because I know that in many cases, trying to work within the system, work publicly, or play the long game isn't always possible and just flat out doesn't work. So there are many cases where people do choose to leave their job because of the position or the lack of position that a company has taken. And again, if we go back to that same Edelman survey that I referenced earlier, in fact, 34% of employees surveyed left a job solely because the company remained silent on a societal or political issue that they believed the company had an obligation to publicly address. So many of us are not just facing silence. You're not just facing, organizations that are actively promoting continued aggression. You're not just facing silence. You're facing companies that are actively promoting continued aggression. So again, keep in mind, companies are not obligated to take a stand on societal and political issues, and they are obligated to provide a safe workplace free of harassment and discrimination. So these are obviously, making the decision to leave is a very individual one, and one that you could absolutely be justified in doing. But as I said at the beginning, it really is based on a unique situation and something that you should seek guidance and consultation around as much as possible. I also then just want to close with just recognizing the mental health effect this is having on so many people. Vicarious trauma is real, and that's if you're not directly impacted. Many people are directly impacted, and family that are directly impacted, and the trauma those individuals are experiencing is unfathomable. So as this conflict continues and the horrifying nature of it continues, unfortunately, it is really important that you do recognize the rights that you have from a mental health perspective, from an accommodation perspective, and that you leverage these if necessary. So this does take an emotional toll and can put people into personal crisis. So if you are directly impacted and you're experiencing any kind of secondary or primary or vicarious trauma, then you need to seek medical assistance. You need to ask for accommodation in writing, and of course, get consultation from all the respective resources. You have the right to request for time off, to leverage any kind of personal benefits that exist. And inshallah, this isn't what people are experiencing, but I know that it is for many. So I also just wanted to reiterate that. So I think that I'll pause there, stop there, and then inshallah, we can talk more during the Q&A session.
Thank you so very much, Nabila. We appreciate that presentation. For those of you who might have joined late, I'm Corey Saylor. I'm with CAIR. I get the opportunity to introduce both of our expert speakers tonight, and I'm also keeping an eye on the Q&A and recording your questions. So once Zaina has finished her presentation, we'll be posing some of those questions to our experts. So Nabila, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Zaina now and get straight into her comments. Nabila talked about getting professional representation from an attorney if you need it within your corporation, and introducing a professionally representing attorney as we speak. Zaina Galawanji is an attorney at the National Office of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Her work is focused on advocating for American Muslim employees who are the targets of discrimination and retaliation. One of the cases she manages was recently cited by the Supreme Court in their decision in Groff versus DeJoy. So I will turn it over to you, Zaina, to give remarks from a legal perspective. For our audience, please keep putting questions in the Q&A. We're keeping an eye on them, and we'll be posing them to our experts in a short moment.
Thank you, Corey. And thank you, Nabila, for your perspective. That's helpful. I tend to come in when things are not going so well, and so my approaches tend to be much more defensive and a little bit aggressive. But I think it's really important in this situation to understand both the rights that we have and the rights that we don't have, because the reality that we're facing is that the laws aren't super great when it comes to speech in the workplace. You have to understand that most employment is at will. And so that means that employers have the right to fire employees for any reason at all, as long as it's not, because of discrimination or in violation of some protection. I'm going to talk first about your First Amendment protections, and then I will talk about anti-discrimination laws, and I will finish off with your union activities that are protected. So the First Amendment, this is really important to note, the First Amendment protects people from having their speech interfered with by the government. The First Amendment will not protect you with your private employer. People are often like, I have free speech rights in this country, so I should be able to say what I want at work. The First Amendment is not going to protect you if you work for a private employer. It applies to people who work with public employers, like government employees, for example. So the First Amendment, we all know, protects freedom of speech. Public employees have limited First Amendment rights in the workplace. So people who work for the government, your speech as a public employee is protected. If you are making the speech as a private citizen about a matter of public concern and your speech doesn't interfere with the job. So something like Palestine would be considered a matter of public concern. Political, social situations that are of concern to the community are matters of public concern. Speech can interfere with the job depending on a variety of factors. So you want to consider the manner, the time, and place of speech. Are you making the speech at work? Are you making it outside of work? Is the speech going to impair, harmony among your coworkers? Is it distracting? Is it impeding performance? Those are things we want to consider when we're wondering whether our speech is interfering with the job. There's going to be a balancing test, but overall, it's really important to remember the First Amendment applies to public employees in limited circumstances. There are some states that have laws that provide protections for employees participating in political activity or speech. So for example, California, it broadly prohibits any employer from enforcing a rule or policy that forbids or prevents employees from engaging in politics or controlling their political activities. This is a great law. The reality is that most states do not have laws like this. So it's really important to check your local state laws if you're working for a private employer. There are also counties that have political protection. So check to see if your specific county has enacted something. I know there are a couple of counties in Maryland that have this. Moving on, I do the next thing I want to talk about is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. This is the traditional employment anti-discrimination law that I typically deal with. So Title VII basically protects you from discrimination in your workplace based on who you are as a person. So it prohibits your employer from discriminating against you based on your race, your religion, your national origin, your sex. Important to note that Title VII applies to employers with 15 or more employees. So if you're in a workplace that has less than 15 employees, Title VII does not kick in to protect you. But there are also state laws. So where, for example, if you're working with an employer with less than 15 employees, there might be a state law that says, hey, we'll cover you. If you're in a workplace that has, for example, between 3 and 14 employees. So important to check both local state laws and federal laws. I emphasize that this protects you based on who you are as a person because it does not necessarily extend to speech. I do think there's an intersection between speech and who we are as people, but that is a lot more gray than, for example, someone terminating you based on the fact that you are a Muslim person. So keep that in mind. Title VII also it protects you with regards to not just who you are as a person, but it protects a couple of activities that I want to emphasize. So number one, discrimination complaints are protected. If you go to HR and you file a discrimination complaint, that is protected. Your employer cannot retaliate against you for filing a discrimination complaint. Keep in mind, retaliation does happen, and that's why there are laws that provide legal remedies if you are retaliated against, but your employer should not be retaliating against you for filing a discrimination complaint. A scenario in which we might be facing discrimination and where Title VII might kick in is, let's say, for example, I, as a person, was talking about Palestine on my social media, and I made a comment about the amount of lives lost in Gaza, and I am a Muslim. And then someone else comes in, non-Muslim, makes a comment also about the lives lost in Gaza on social media. I am terminated, that other employee is not. You could have a discrimination claim there, and it would be worth filing a discrimination complaint if you feel like there's some unequal treatment, that you as a Muslim or you as an Arab is being treated differently than your non-Muslim, non-Arab colleagues. Keep in mind that Title VII doesn't necessarily prohibit viewpoint discrimination. So if I am talking about my support for Palestine and someone else is talking about their support for Israel, related but not necessarily the same, so just something to keep in mind. But it doesn't mean that you should be afraid to speak out. You should just understand kind of the things that protect you and the things that don't protect you. Title VII also protects religious accommodations requests. This is actually important for our free speech rights. A lot of us as Muslims and a lot of other faith groups believe that we are required to advocate on behalf of people who are facing injustice. There's a hadith that recently I came across: if you can't change something with your hands, change it with your voice. And if you can't change it with your voice, change it with your heart. To the extent that, you know, a private employer has a policy that prohibits you from talking about Palestine in your private capacity, and you sincerely believe as a Muslim that you are required to advocate for, for the people in Palestine, you may want to consider requesting a religious accommodation. I have not had clients who have done this. So I really emphasize talking to a lawyer if you are considering doing this, if there's nothing else that protects you in your workplace. And keep in mind that you cannot be retaliated against for asking for religious accommodation. With employment discrimination complaints, if you're in a situation where your company, you feel like you've been discriminated against and your company is not taking action, or your company, your supervisors have discriminated against you, you have 180 days from the date of the event that was discriminatory to file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That's the government agency that investigates employment discrimination. They have an intake process online. It's pretty straightforward. You don't necessarily need an attorney to go through that process. I still recommend that you talk to one. There are states that will elongate this time period. So there are states that will give you 300 days to file a discrimination complaint. And there are state agencies that cover, but make sure that you talk to an attorney as soon as you feel like you've been discriminated against. The last thing I want to talk about is union activities, something that we don't typically consider, but people, like, our union activities as employees are protected. So most employees in the private sector are covered by the National Labor Relations Act, which protects our union activities. The act, however, does include or exclude specific individuals, like federal, state, or local government employees, agricultural workers, independent contractors. So talk to an attorney or check the statute and see who the act does not apply to. But the NLRA forbids employers from interfering with or restraining your exercise of rights relating to organizing, forming, joining, or assisting a labor organization, or from working together to improve terms and conditions of employment. So you should understand that in the situation that we're in, it would make sense to reach out to our unions if you have a union at work, to get them to help advocate on your behalf, because your union activities are protected. And we really should be utilizing our unions in this instance. To the extent that your union actually cares about you, there are instances in which there are unions who don't necessarily advocate well for us, but I hope this isn't the case for us. So yeah, those are the three main protections I wanted to talk about. And I strongly urge that if you're in a situation where you've been disciplined, terminated, you really want to talk to a lawyer right away, because there are time limits for, filing a complaint.
All right. Thank you very much, Zaina. And, I'm going to just dive right on into Q&A, and Nabila was quick on coming back. I was actually just going to pose a quick question to Zaina while you were coming back, Nabila. So, Zaina, Lisa is asking, can a private employee participate in a rally, protest, give speeches, media bites, chant slogans, hold signs about the Palestine situation outside of work hours?
You have to understand that there are no protections for this. Your employer can terminate you from participating in those activities, but to the extent that, for example, you are a Muslim participating in a pro-Palestine rally, and there is, let's say, a colleague who's not Muslim who participates in the same pro-Palestine rally, and you're terminated and they're not, you might have a discrimination claim. With regards to participating in a Palestine rally versus an Israel rally, it's not as easy, because it's so hard already to prove discrimination when we have very clear facts. But when you have the facts that not sort of the same, it becomes more difficult. But it's like what Nabila was saying, you just want to be aware of your policies. And I'm sure Nabila could talk more about that if she wants.
Yeah, I mean, you can be considered a representative of the company at almost any point in time. So even an hourly employee who leaves the workplace in, say, their uniform and does something on their personal time off the clock, if there have any indication of representing the company, they could be considered, that could be considered a violation of their company policy. If you're a more senior individual, again, as I said earlier, you could be considered representing the company, and anything you say could be considered representing the company. So you really need to understand the policy that the companies have to know how to answer that question. So it's very unique, company by company and individual by individual.
All right, thanks. I'm going back earlier in the question list, and Alyssa Martinez asked, if she's advocating on the issue internally, I think it gets to the heart of how to best escalate it. Does she go to the CEO, or does she go to DEI leadership first? Like, how do you begin to advance the conversation in most corporate settings?
So if it was me, I would start with if you're comfortable with your direct manager and leader, and ask for their support. So share about your lived experience, share how it's affecting you, share how you're feeling, and ask them for their guidance as the respective manager or leader of your department. And I would actually work up that chain of command. If you get the support of your direct management, your director, then you would go with that support to diversity, equity, inclusion manager or head of DE&I, have the same conversation, and then go from there. I would work up the chain of command as a starting point, and see how that works. If that doesn't work, then you can always escalate further to your CHRO. And then after that, your CEO. If you have an executive, often diversity, equity, inclusion has an executive sponsor. So I would find out who that executive sponsor is and speak to them and get their advice. Again, when you start with your lived experience and how it's affecting you, and if there's others who want to join you, so you have power in numbers, that's how I would approach it.
All right, thank you very much. Zaina, I think this one comes back to your area of expertise, and it's anonymous, but if you work for a private employer that takes federal money, are you still protected under the First Amendment, or is it a private employer?
This is something that I was actually looking into today, and I have not been able to find anything to support this. I know that there are certain titles of the Civil Rights Act that will kick in, but nothing that I think of that could be particularly helpful for our situation. So I'm going to say no. But I would love for somebody to prove me wrong. Please email me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're our expert. We'll try to pull in an audience member. Nabila, any thoughts that you might add to that? Because you're certainly reacting
No,
to the question.
Outside of my area of expertise, that's a good question.
Okay, and not a problem. Totally understand that. Camille asked, if I resign, should I mention concerns about bias or Islamophobia in a resignation letter or in an exit interview? So should you document it?
So I'm sure Zaina can give great advice on this as well. So from a personal perspective, not setting aside kind of the legal side of things, it's a personal choice. Some people just want to leave on good terms and not divulge all their frustrations and concerns about why they're leaving and leave it at that. Others feel very strongly that they want to express explicitly why they're leaving and put that in writing. If you plan on doing anything post your employment with what happened at work, then I would advise putting it in writing, but I'll leave Zaina to reflect on that. But it comes down to personal choice. I don't know if there's one, unless you're going to take some legal action. I'm sure Zaina could advise on that.
Yeah, I mean, and I have people who don't, but to the extent that you do want to preserve a legal claim. So first of all, if you feel like you're being discriminated against, make sure to notify your employer prior to resigning so that they can take action to correct the situation if that's feasible, because sometimes it's like the higher ups that are discriminating, and we can't do anything. But you have to give the company notice that you've been discriminated against so that they can remedy the situation. Because if I was an employer and I got an employment discrimination complaint, I would say, well, you didn't tell me about this. There was no way that I would know. And so there was nothing that I could do about it. However, in a situation also where the discrimination is happening very publicly, let's say you're facing harassment and it's in front of all your colleagues, then the company has notice. And to the extent that you have not complained about discrimination, it would be helpful for you to do so upon. So there's some evidence, something in writing that this did occur. That would at least be very helpful for me as an attorney to see something in writing.
Thank you very much. This kind of, I think, goes back to the advocating within your company. And it's another anonymous question, but the questioner sort of is essentially saying there's internal bad statements, in terms of the company's position. Sounds like it took a position supporting Israeli apartheid. There have been sessions that sort of focus against bias against one set of employees, but not against all employees who may be impacted by this current wave of backlash. How do I go about inside my corporate structure advocating to get more sessions that would focus on bias against Arabs and Islamophobia?
So again, I would still follow the same kind of escalation model I shared earlier. I would bring facts, the statistics on the rise of Islamophobia and how it's affecting Muslim and anti-Arab sentiment, and the rise of anti-Arab sentiment is, as we know, why we're having the session, the highest it's ever been since the announcement of the Muslim ban or 9/11. So I think, again, taking a position of trying to educate and advocate for the need to do this, linking it to your DE&I policy, linking it to any positions against harassment, discrimination, and then talking about the benefit of it. I think, again, saying, I appreciate the session on anti-Semitism. I learned something. Hopefully you learned something in that. I think there'd be equal learning if we held a session on anti-Muslim hate or anti-Arab sentiment and its rise, both at work and outside of work. Here's some facts of what's happening. If there's a partner organization that can offer that training, like CAIR, that could come in and offer that, here's the resource that could come in and offer that training for the organization. Make it as easy as possible, provide the case for why it's beneficial to the company, link it to the company's diversity, equity, inclusion policy. Approach your manager if you can get support from them, and then go to diversity, equity, inclusion or your HR team with that ask. It is, I hosted a session on anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia when I was at Walmart Canada. It was the first time it had ever been done, and it was very well received, and many people learned a lot of things. I know there's other companies doing the same thing. It's not that common, so I don't want to make it seem like it's super common, because it's not. But this is where we play the long game. We need to help our companies recognize that it's a problem, then advocate for education and awareness.
Yeah, I don't know how it is in Canada, but here in the States, I think we could use more courses on bias every day. You name the type of bias, we seem to have a problem with it over the last few years. So
I'm American by birth, so I know what it's like.
yeah.
I know what it's like on both sides.
Certainly more classes to teach people the basic thing I thought I learned in elementary school, which is don't hate people for the way they look, the way they sound, where they're from, their religion. Like, let's just figure that one out, folks. Abdurrahman actually has a follow-up to the question. So we've been talking about how do you advocate internally, and what Abdurrahman is saying is he had the conversation already with DEI and HR, and they were great meetings, and then he got a blank. Like, nothing's happened since. So what's a good way to follow up?
I'll just be very honest, like, they might not necessarily be the ultimate decision makers, right? So they're probably, if it's never been done before, they might not know how. The average DE&I person isn't necessarily versed in interfaith or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, or how to hold those kind of tensions that exist around this type of a topic. So I don't know what a reasonable amount of time is to give them to follow up, but I just, for all the DE&I advocates or professionals out there, this isn't a very common space that they tend to get a lot of experience in. So I would just politely follow up, if, give them some time and politely follow up and ask how you can help. And again, offer resources that could come in and provide the training, or give them resources like CAIR and others that could help support the organization in education and advocacy for this.
So Zaina, Benish has a follow-up. How does hostile work environment apply in these situations?
So a hostile work environment is basically if you're experiencing harassment that's, severe or pervasive, and it creates a hostile work environment. So a hostile work environment is traditionally understood as, and legally understood as, facing harassment. And to give you an example of how high, like what severe means or pervasive means, for example, there was a court that in a case that I came across where saying the N-word one time was not considered, did not meet the threshold for harassment. It wasn't severe enough, which I obviously disagree with. But some courts they just have really high standards for what harassment is. Hostile work environment, I know that I've gotten a lot of people who are saying like this pro-Israel messaging that's coming out of the company is creating like a hostile work environment. I still think it's worth like telling the company like, hey, your messaging is creating a hostile work environment for me as a Muslim or as a Palestinian. Legally, like there's no strong case there. It's usually harassment, but it's still worth talking to the employer.
Yeah. And this next one kind of goes to folks struggling with what are the guardrails, like recognizing that it's hard to give a specific answer given that different corporations have, very different policies, but still the question feels pretty innocuous. I've been liking posts and sharing some posts. They're not graphic images on my LinkedIn profile. What do you think about that? Am I
So
putting
I would
myself
just
at
say,
risk?
yeah, I've never seen what's happening on LinkedIn ever happen on LinkedIn. It is getting very, yeah, I've never seen it happen before, the kind of discourse that's taking place on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is considered a professional work site. People who, if you have a profile on LinkedIn, you're there as, representing yourself as an employee of a company. The link that would be considered a representation of the company would be more strongly made if you're using LinkedIn as your primary platform to advocate for a certain point or position. I say all that saying that, if you're advocating for human rights, if you're advocating for, children's rights, if you're advocating for peace, those are things that I would generally, again, consider to be safe. I don't know what's happened with the world where all of a sudden that seems risky to advocate for human rights and the protection of life. Like, I don't know what happened where that became like, it felt like a risk to do that. It shouldn't be. But I would just reiterate, go back to your social media policy. If there's graphic images, or if there's any kind of hostile or hate-filled language or any kind of violent, like, absolutely steer away from it. That's my advice. I know, Zaina, if you want to challenge that or change that.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't think we should be living in a world where like advocating for human rights or liking stuff that's like people shouldn't die should get you in trouble, but it is. And private employers can fire you for any reason that's not discrimination. So yeah, they can fire you for sharing a post on your LinkedIn, and if you're a government employee and it says like, hey, I work for the Department of Homeland Security on my LinkedIn, and you're sharing something that DHS doesn't want you to be sharing, like you're not necessarily like making speech as a private citizen. I would argue that you are doing it in your capacity as a DHS employee. And so you really want to be careful on LinkedIn. And non-attorney advice, and feel free to disregard it if you don't like it. I've seen activists who are advocating for like removing personal identifying information from your profiles when you're sharing stuff about Palestine. And like, it sucks that we have to do that, but I don't know, I've seen people doing it and it might be helpful, but it's not legal advice.
So we're coming up on the end of our hour together. And before I pose what I believe will be the last question to our experts, I do just want to pose one request to our audience. You know, CAIR is the nation's largest Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization. In the last 4 weeks, we have had 1,283 incoming requests for help or complaints of bias. That's a 216% increase in our incoming calls, and our staff capacity does not change. So many people like Zaina have been working very long, very hard hours, and it's greatly appreciated. So if you would consider supporting us, you can go to cair.com and do that, and we would appreciate it. So I'm going to pose to the two of you what I think is a very difficult question to answer. So I'm glad I'm not one of the experts speaking tonight. But it does really get to a core of what I think a lot of people are struggling with in their workplace. So the question that Ali posed very early on in the conversation is, how do you stand up for Palestinian rights in a way that feels authentic to you, while at the same time staying sort of neutral as it seems like the workplace wants you to be? And I think that's causing a disconnect in a lot of people because they feel like, to your point, Zaina, we're being told to shut up in a country that values free speech. And to what Nabila said, we're talking about saving lives, which should never be controversial in my book. So as an employee, like, is there a way that any thoughts that either of you have on how people can reconcile those two things, keeping myself safe at work, but at the same time doing what my conscience dictates?
I mean, I'm just saying, I have the long game, and I'll talk about the current circuit. So the long game for me is, as Muslims, we need to articulate that our faith is a primary dimension of our diversity and our uniqueness. And I think that is not necessarily always the case. I speak to a lot of Muslim professionals, and there's still this kind of shyness to ask for anything or to, I know shyness is probably the best word to say it, but when we're having this DE&I conversation in our workplace and this whole ethos of diversity and inclusion, your faith whether your Palestinian identity or your identity in terms of your national origin, if that's a primary dimension of your diversity and your uniqueness, articulate that, not just now, but again, for the long game. So I think that's really important. We need to be unapologetic about these things on a daily basis, so that when conflicts like this arise, we're not just raising our voices now, but it's a continuous drumbeat of what's important to us in the workplace. So that's that. With this current circumstance and what's happening right now, if you are on the side of the protection of human rights, if you are leveraging, and the protection of humanity, and you tie that to company corporate values or philanthropic statements, and what I said at the beginning, that would be, where I go and where I would start, and just avoid more controversial statements as much as possible.
Yeah, and just like from a legal perspective, if you want to speak out and protect yourself, I really recommend talking to your union for guidance if you have one. And if that's not an option, like, you may want to consider, I want to tell you, like, file a discrimination complaint with the company alleging a hostile work environment so that you're protected. But then I'm also like, okay, but I don't, like, retaliation is a thing that happens. So I don't know. I don't have good answers as an attorney. Like, the law is just not very good for us right now. But Nabila's advice is great.
And I would just, again, go back to what I said at the beginning. Your lived experience is your lived experience. My parents fled Lebanon when Israel invaded Lebanon. That's my experience. No one can tell me that that's wrong. When I share that and the share that impacted that, that's real. So that's, again, that one-on-one conversation does make a difference.
All right. Well, we are at the end of our time together. Nabila and Zaina, thank you both. I mean, so much for giving time out of your day to talk to everybody about, advocating for Palestinian humanity and, continuing to keep yourself safe and being effective with that advocacy in the workplace. We really appreciate it. And we definitely really appreciate everybody who joined us for the last hour. Thank you all for giving us time out of your evening. And inshallah, we will get a permanent ceasefire very soon. And inshallah, we will see an end to the occupation and the apartheid in the very near future. We'll say good night. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Like a song.